Hi, it's iBookBinding's podcast again, and today our guest is Kahn, a bookseller, and we are going to discuss books, interesting books, artist books, and yeah, one specific project that Ian is working on right now, and we'll see how it goes. And hi, Ian.
I,
Nice to have you here finally, because I think we wanted to invite you quite a while ago, but today's today. And I'm Stepan. I'm in Windsor, UK, and my co-host is Pavel. He's joining us from Belgrade again,
Belgrade,
and not from
Belgrade this time,
Sofia
yeah.
this time. Yeah, now from Belgrade, from Serbia. So
And I'm in Portland, Maine.
yeah,
So we've
yeah.
got quite the spread.
Yeah. Well, one of the reasons we are streaming during the European evening today is that you are from the US. So it's not morning. It's after midday. It's 1 p.m. As far as I remember. But still, it would be a bit too late for us if we start later. Then maybe a bit too early for you if we start earlier. So,
This is a perfect time for me.
well, that's great. As usual, we invite our guests to leave some comments, whether it's some questions to our guests, to us, or if you would like to share from where you are joining us, from which country, which city, town, locality, whatever. Also, we have some useful links in the description of this video, links to Ian's bookshop, Lux Mentis, and link to Kickstarter project that we're going to discuss today, and also links to some of our social media accounts, including Patreon, where you can support us with your money. Please do that. We really appreciate that. So let's start with this Kickstarter project, and then we'll see how it goes.
Um, well, all right.
You wanted
The
to start with something
Kickstarter.
else? We can do something else.
No, no,
Sorry.
no. No. I've tried to figure out how to lead. Um, the Kickstarter. We actually started thinking about this. It's been at least a couple years. We knew that Mark was going to retire at sometime in the foreseeable future. So we started thinking about, I had started thinking about what we could do that would sort of create a lasting legacy and a sort of broad thank you, if you will, for everything he's done in 25 years at the Library of Congress. And he had Tim Ely, who's a tremendous book artist and binder. I represent his work and have known him for a long while now, and knew that Mark was really adored this piece of his called Bones of the Book, and it's arguably Tim's kind of monumental cornerstone work. Um, in every sense, it's massive. It's double elephant folio, and it's big and exquisite, and the binding is jaw dropping. Everything about it is just sort of stunning. Um,
I guess I'd have to
as
ask you to tell a bit more about Mark and Timothy. It's
I'll
sort of
get
out of the blue.
absolutely. So
Yeah.
so so that's fine. Um, so Mark Dimunation was the chief of rare books at the Library of Congress, and he has been there. He's at Cornell before and Stanford before that. Um, he's been at the Library of Congress for about 25 years, and has done some remarkable things there. When he first came on, his kind of, if you will, his charge when he came on was to rebuild Jefferson's lost library. As people may or may not know, the Library of Congress burned early on. Well, the British burned it um, early on, and when they set out, when the government, wanted to sort of rebuild it, if you will, Jefferson sold them at a fair bit of money, but far less than it was worth at the time. He sold them his personal library, and that became the core of the new Library of Congress, which also burned. So most of Jefferson's books were lost in that second fire. And one of the things that Mark did when he first came to the LC was begin a project to reconstitute, to bring together that library again. Obviously not in the lost copies, but in other copies purchased or donated to the LC, purchased by or donated to. And if you visit the Library of Congress now, if you go in and sort of head to the right, Jefferson's library is in a sort of circular display space, if you will, shelf space, so that you can kind of stand in the middle and be more or less surrounded by Jefferson's collection. There are still a couple hundred little white cards. It's about, if my memory serves, it was about 1,700 books. And they have been successful in securing all but a couple hundred. And for each of the books that are still missing, there's a white card on the shelf. And they remain actively trying to do, they would love to finish that project, I know. And that was, Mark spent years sort of driving that project. And in many ways, that will undoubtedly be one of the things he's most often remembered for is that Jefferson collection. But for my, for my purposes here, and I think in some ways more broadly, the greater legacy both within the LC and within the book world, and particularly the modern creators world broadly, is that Mark set out very early on to build. It's not that there weren't artist books at the Library of Congress prior to Mark, but it was Mark who really, if you will, saw it as a subject area that was worth defining, scoping, and building towards. And over 25 years, he has built one of the truly great book arts collections anywhere. I think in his first, one of the things, he was asked once about sort of the daunting nature of becoming the chief of rare books at the LC. And he talked about sort of that first week, what do you buy? You're the new chief of rare books at the Library of Congress. What do you buy? What's your first purchase? What's your first week of purchases? And, I think it's really telling that one of the first things he purchased that first week was a cornerstone work of Ken Campbell, the British book artist and printer. And they went on from that initial purchase. I think the Library of Congress is the only institution that has a complete run of everything Ken ever printed. He's really, Mark has in many ways driven a major aspect of where we are today with modern book art, and to some extent with design binding as an extension, which is to say, um, his interest and his advocacy for book arts broadly um, has really driven uh, has really driven other institutions to look at design bindings, to look at book arts broadly as subject areas worthy of collecting. There are a great deal more institutions looking at artist books and the like, and using them in the classroom, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm not saying that wouldn't have happened otherwise, but I think Mark and his profile in that position was a critical driver for a lot of where we are now, which is part of why this seemed like a good thing to do, this project and Tim's Bones of the Book, because here's a book that is stunning in almost every sense of the word, um, and frankly expensive. And one of the things, and part of the idea with the Kickstarter, Mark has always referred to the Library of Congress as long as as long as I can remember, 20 years. He's always referred to the Library of Congress as the People's Library, and I always loved that. And in thinking about this, I loved the idea of the people, capital P, capital P, thanking him collectively, if you will, for his work at the People's Library. And in that role, it's very hard for him to justify an acquisition like Bones of the Book, because the focus there, it's tax dollars at work, so it's the broadest, deepest amount of material one can bring in for X dollars. And when you have one item that is not insignificantly expensive, you have to make choices, and it's hard not to appreciate and respect that. So if we can figure out a way to get it there, as a donation, quote unquote, that's what we're hoping to pull off. And it's very cool, presuming we pull it off, which I'm confident. I'm pretty confident. One of the things Tim is going to do, and I think you're going to show some examples of the book and whatnot. Tim has a very distinctive style. He created, there's a cipher text.
Yeah, Pavel,
that
maybe
is
you can
incorporated.
share the screen with the Kickstarter page and show some of the photos.
Okay.
Okay. So there's a cipher text that is integrated into a lot of. Oh, I'll be quiet for a minute and we can watch this.
You can talk.
Yep. Become part of the Library of Congress's extraordinary collection of artist books. It's a lasting tribute to all that Mark Dimunation has done for the People's Library and for the world as a whole. This book is both biographical and autobiographical, honoring the important influence of family members in Tim's life while combining it with aspects of the nature of bookbinding. The book being the primary form that Tim has chosen to house his artwork throughout his career. As with all of Tim's art, there are layers which reference alchemy, mathematics, mythology, geography, and geology. The book is bound in a binding that Tim created, what he refers to as a planetary collage standard binding. It includes hand-sewn, hand-dyed Irish linen endbands and half-loose guards, which will be described in a bit. There's goat skin spine, resin and pigment encrusted boards, which incorporate 6 works of art on paper inlaid at the front board. The binding includes resin, rivets, paint, ink, wax, gilt, colored foil, and blind tooling, and then hand-painted end papers, also by Tim. The text block is a combination of manuscript and letterpress, then drawn and painted throughout in ink, dry pigment, watercolor, and graphite. Tim said of this work, to quote, "In the early part of the last decade of the 20th century, I wish to contemplate my origins, especially the early and all-consuming attraction to the form of the book and how that might have evolved for me. Beyond deep reading, I have found that the best way to become informed about an event or gather a bit of enlightenment is to make an expressive book. Bones of the Book began as a thought structure aimed at the skeletal system of the body and of the book, as they seem to me to contain functions that echo each other. I also wanted to fuse the influences of my parents and their choice of livelihood into the book by referencing the location of their hardware store and its impact on what I have chosen to do as an artist. Bones of the Book reflects both my identity as a maker of things and bones as structural supports, and how that metaphor maps itself onto the cultural object and artifact of the book. As parts of the book traditionally have names of body parts to identify the book terrain, this seemed particularly apt. Books have dorsal structure, a spine, just as humans do, and if this spine is damaged, it is compromised. A book has a head and a tail, and sometimes this head is crowned in gold, gilded, or otherwise given an ornamental treatment. As the names of a book's parts and their functions lend connection to bones and anatomy, so does the chosen structure of this book. Search for both an appropriately robust and workable binding and one that properly expresses my artistic intentions provided a series of opportunities to examine a sampling of medieval books that satisfied these requirements. The structural skeleton of Bones of the Book is supported by a continuous membrane of aged tambi, a Japanese paper possessed of astonishing properties. This paper forms a long double fold along each folio and is known as a half-loose guard. Being somewhat impenetrable to adhesive, this paper reduces the friction of the folio so that it facilitates, without drag, the mobility of the book structure itself. Put simply, it opens well without adding stress to the binding. In tandem with the sewing supports, cotton textile and tissue as metaphoric muscle mass, the book begins to resemble an intelligent and projective body, end quote. The last 40 years, his books and other works have sprung from a central core of concepts, owing to a fascination with obscure and seemingly incomprehensible forms inspired by science and other projections in the history of human imagination. This spectrum of inspiration includes such things as fractured and whole grids, cipher systems, landforms and landscapes as viewed from satellites, and the archaeological overlay onto some of these sites, especially those containing libraries. Originally, the Atlas format provided a platform for rendering his complex maps, which gradually gave way to an expanded psychological viewpoint of a larger universal scheme which we find embodied in this work. Bones of the Book is a monumental piece, and one which Mark has mentioned more than once that he wished could be part of the People's Library. It is our hope that this Kickstarter will succeed in placing it at the Library of Congress as a lasting tribute to all Mark has done for both the library and for the book world as a whole. Please consider supporting this effort, and we thank you. Finally, if we are successful in meeting our goal, we wish to share that any and all excess funds will be used to create an endowed fund in Mark's name dedicated to adding additional artist books to the Library of Congress's collection into the indefinite future. Thank you again, and we hope you will consider supporting us in this effort. There's almost nothing worse than listening to yourself, a recording of yourself.
There is one question that immediately springs to mind. Why is it so expensive, and where is it now?
It's two
Um,
questions.
that's two questions. The easy question is, it's about 5 feet below me and 10 feet that way, which is to say, it's down in my library at the moment. As to expense, you know, valuing art ever is inexplicably subjective, and the number of variables that play into it um, are both myriad and complex and subtle. The short answer is, or not so short answer, is that Tim is at this point in his career, and because of his life's work, he is a, if you will, a significant artist with a capital A, and his work has a particular market value. This particular book, Tim, one of the mechanisms Tim uses to set prices has to do with, if you will, the square inches of original art. And with a book like this, the amount of art embodied in that one object is tremendous. When if you think about one-off pieces, one-off exemplars of some of that would have an insular value of whatever it would in the gallery, $25,000. I'm just picking numbers, but and then you have a dozen spreads, you end up with a number that's just challenging in a lot of ways. And it's one of the things, frankly, that makes book art at the sophisticated end, if you will, begin to become really problematic, to be completely honest. Because on one hand, you begin to have work that is beyond the reach of virtually any library. You begin to have work that's just, frankly, inhibitingly expensive for a library to justify with their budget. And at the same time, you have work that, for instance, a major museum may be interested in. Well, in this particular case, there's a well-known New York museum that was really interested in this particular book. Their problem isn't the price at all. It's the fact that museums generally have a real problem with an art object that requires you physically engage with it. There's no way to really experience this piece of art unless you turn the pages. So when book art becomes posh, if you will, when you have a book artist who has become a major figure and whose work is, as a result, significantly valued, you really do begin to get into this space that is very challenging, and is the reason why most major objects like this end up in private collections. And if they end up someplace institutionally, it's because it came to the institution as part of a donation or bequest. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's one of those things that's an interesting thing to have to think about and try to solve for. And as a dealer who, a great deal of what I do revolves around representing the work of modern creating book artists. And on one hand, my goal is that the book artists and the binders that I work with are able to afford to do what it is they want to do without having to sort of have side gigs to have a roof and food. So on one hand, I actively work to build the market to make their to help people see the value in their work. And at the same time, the sort of catch-22 there is the more successful I get at that, the more challenging it is to place their work in institutions. And again, there's always private collections, but there's something to be said for a piece, for instance, like this. Excuse me. You have a piece that is really arguably the sort of most important piece of Tim's canon. And do we want that in a private collection where one person and their friends can share it when they choose to, and occasionally they may loan it someplace, or do we want that somewhere where,
or occasionally they can damage it somehow, which also happens.
Sure, absolutely. So that's not exactly an answer. Well, actually, I guess it is. A piece is worth what it's worth. It's worth what the market will pay for it. And in Tim's case, the market for his work is where it is. And this is the most valuable piece of his work, but it is also the most valuable piece of his work. So that's why you end up with those prices.
So you mentioned
sorry, Pavel. I wanted to say a couple of things. Firstly, I wanted to remind our viewers that they can leave comments and ask questions, and please tell us from where you join us. It's always interesting to see from which part of the world our viewers coming, and well, it makes us happier when we see this information. And also I wanted to say that in your answer you touched several major topics that we discussed on our live streams and podcasts quite a few times, starting with exhibiting books, and we talked to a lot of people who had troubles with exhibiting books or tried to invent or create some book stands or something like that, like Richard Minsky or Kate Holland, for example. We also talked, literally last week we talked to a book artist who told us a lot about her huge book projects that are also quite challenging to exhibit. So that's a topic we touch upon quite a lot. And the other thing was that when we recorded our podcast with Daniel Kelm, he mentioned that when he was in the early stages of his career, he was trying to sell his artist books, and he started with selling them as books, but soon he found out that selling them as art objects on art market brings him much more cash. So yeah, that's
absolutely. Absolutely. There's an example, actually an example I have down on my table in the library. There's an Italian publisher whose name I'm blanking on right now. I apologize. It's not Colophon, but it's close to that. They did a collaborative piece on Claudio Cora, an Italian composer, and I apologize that I'm blanking on this name. I'm either under or over caffeinated. I'm not sure which. Tragic. They did this collaborative piece on this composer, and it's a lovely, simply and elegantly designed book on his life and work in a box, the lid of which is a signed limited because it was limited to however many copies of this there were. I forget, to be completely honest, say 45-ish. But the lid is a Pomodoro bronze, signed by Pomodoro, and a piece of his sculptural work, the size that this is $75,000, $90,000. The book with this case is 30,000, or 32,000, which is a nice way of saying it's an extraordinarily expensive, nicely designed letterpress book, or that has this remarkable lid, or it's a Pomodoro sculpture that is impaired with a book. And the tragedy of it, as far as I'm concerned, is that a number of them have ended up at museum collections, and I more or less guarantee that the bottom of the box and the book itself are in an accession drawer, and the lid, the sculptural element, is mounted on the wall, because at the end of the day, it's an inexpensive way to buy a Pomodoro sculpture. And that's a weird, it's a weird problem with book art broadly, and probably an increasingly significant one. And it's always been the case, and maybe it's just that I and others are sort of more cognizant of or have more of a focus to put items in particular collections, in particular institutions, in particular museums, etc. And that becomes much harder. And maybe the issue is to sort of step back and figure out if there's a sort of funding mechanism, and to some extent this Kickstarter is a little bit of a kind of proof of concept, and it's at the high end of the spectrum, so to speak, but there is an increasing body of work that, while it may not be $100,000, 50,000, 25,000, 10,000 is a long stretch for a lot of institutions. And figuring out, when I started representing book art and book artists, I remember the first piece I had that was over $10,000, vellum super deluxe edition of Leonard Baskin's Makemake. And now I have, I don't know, a couple dozen, at least a couple dozen book art pieces here that are solidly north of 10 grand. I have design bindings here, modern design bindings. I'm not talking, I'm not talking beignets, but the work of modern design binders that is solidly north of 10,000. And finding I have nothing against selling to private collectors. I sell a lot to private collectors, and they have a hugely important role in a whole bunch of different ways, and in advocating the work of creators, etc. You can't sing the private market enough praises. The flip side is it's unfortunate when you begin to see or when the sort of one of the aspects of side effects of success in the area is that you lose the ability to sell into institutions. I have at least a couple young binders who a fair bit of their work now is 10 grand plus for for things they create, and that becomes a limiting factor as to where it can go. As much as an institution might love and want something, it's a steep, it's a big ask, so to speak. And either librarians start trying to leverage private donation, etc., or the artists or the booksellers have to start figuring out ways that make such things possible. It's almost undoubtedly not the librarians, because their focus and their dollars are already hyper committed, shall we say. So taking that burden off them has a lot of value. If that makes sense.
Ian, don't you think that it would be easier to find sources of finances for this purpose if the objects themselves, once they get into collections, were much more accessible to the public? It's really easy to imagine a big collection push to find money to buy a Titian, because people know that once the Titian is in the museum, they will be able to come and see it. But for example, just last summer, I went to Berlin State Library. They have an amazing collection of contemporary artist books. They only exhibit like 5, maybe 6, and only ones that you can see all at once, one that have only one spread or something like that. So there is this problem as well.
There is, and there's no easy answer to that. To some extent, technology is beginning to touch on some of that, at least for insular objects. That said, there's so much out there that technological solutions only go so far, so to speak. It's possible with something like this, with Bones of the Book. It's well within the realm of possibility that the LC would make it a high res video that allowed people, or it's a weird app actually, but that would allow someone to log into the site and be able to turn the pages digitally, if you will, and experience it to some extent that way. The dilemma, and this is a sort of, because there aren't enough problems already, let's add more. The dilemma with that is it's simulacra. It's not the object. And the reality is any printed book, and especially something like one of Tim's books or bindings, which are highly sculptural, or think about the work of Ken Campbell, where he did so much overprinting. A sheet would go through the press so many times that in those cases you can really overtly see the sculptural element of what 9, 10, 11 layers of ink on overlapping in different ways, what it does to the image. The reality is, even things that are, if you will, more subtly printed, they're not two-dimensional. They're three-dimensional. The page, the leaf has form. The ink, particularly if it's letterpress, there is actually a height difference that your eye can pick up even if you're not conscious of it. There are these elements of holding the object or sitting in front of the object and turning the pages that are experientially specific to experiencing it in front of you. That when you look at a digital representation of something, it may be beautiful, but it is in fact a two-dimensional. It's two-dimensional. You lose all depth of image, if you will. And again, it's better than nothing. The best example is the Book of Kells. Because if you go to Trinity and stand in front of the Book of Kells and just sort of take whatever page suite it's open to, that day, it has a very particular look and feel. And they have done a wonderful job putting an extraordinarily high-res piece of work available online that allows you to flip through the pages of the Book of Kells. And it's beautiful, and I've done it more than once because it's stunning. It doesn't come close to what that book looks like when you're standing in front of it. And one of the dilemmas with simulacra, particularly around art objects like this, and it should be noted that this applies every bit as much to art. I have a profound weakness for a particular Van Gogh piece called Crows in a Wheat Field, Crows in a Wheat Field, Crows in Wheat. And I've had the extraordinary pleasure of standing in front of that painting in Amsterdam for a long time because for me, it's one of those things that is jaw-droppingly fabulous. I'm doing this interview with a 48-inch monitor behind one of the three monitors I use is this massive 48-inch screen, the desktop of which is that painting. And I love it because I do. But again, it's not even close because it's flat, because it's two-dimensional. And that goes with any digital representation of art, whether it's book art or otherwise. So it's an interesting, it's one of those sort of almost unanswerable problems. I completely agree that making this work more accessible has huge value. And we're doing that in a few different ways, sometimes with digital projects, sometimes with facsimiles of either one-off or hyper-limited editions, which again are not the object. Another great example, Zimia Grobert spent 3 years. She took a copy of Finnegan's Wake and disbound, first American edition of Finnegan's Wake, had it disbound, cut the text block into strips, maintaining the pagination. And then she spent 3 years knitting the text block back together. And the finished piece, which is now at the Fisher Library and University of Toronto, I'm pleased to say, and it's, I guess, worth interjecting here that was a tremendously expensive piece of work for them. And they were lucky and had the ability to have sort of an endowed fund specifically around Joyce material, et cetera, that allowed them to do this. But, that was a one-off piece. It's fabulous in a whole bunch of different ways. But very smartly, one of the things that Zimia did was to have very high resolution images taken of every page spread of this knitted together text block. And she then had this facsimile that reproduces the 4 volumes that the art object itself was created for. And that's available, for I think it's $300 versus the let's say, many tens of thousands. But it was a great pile of money. Russell Meret did the same thing with his monumental work, Etherwald, etc. In that once that edition sold out, he produced a facsimile, if you will. His partner took photographs, and they created this much more approachable. You have a book that if it comes to market, it's north of 10 grand for a copy, or you can have a $75 copy. The flip side is digital one way or the other. The $75 copy is photographs of a three-dimensional object of the book. So it's representative. And that's often, I think that's where we're going to end up with a lot of these solutions. It's representative of the work, but I think it's important to remind people that it's not the work. If you've looked at the Book of Kells online and you go to Ireland, you should not skip going to see the Book of Kells, because in your mind you've seen the Book of Kells, because you haven't. You have seen a representation of the Book of Kells. And the same can be said for a book like Bones of the Book. If you look at images I've shot, if they end up doing sort of a high-res walkthrough, it may be beautiful, and there's no denying the fact that some of those page spreads, digitally or otherwise, are simply jaw-droppingly beautiful. But the image of it, under any circumstance, is not the same, doesn't have the same visceral effect as the object itself does, as the real thing does.
And what about exhibiting them more widely? What about touring exhibitions? Because not everyone can go to the Library of Congress. I know in UK, British Museum as well as British Library have started a series of small touring exhibitions when they take some of their treasures and first send them to places that are connected to this particular object, and then maybe to some other big cities. Because with books, okay, you can't tour the Book of Kells. You can't make a traveling exhibition of, even if speaking of something more modern, of Audubon's books, because you sort of can, but they usually don't. But with artist books, you could certainly imagine that.
Yeah, yes, there's certainly the ability to create those sort of touring exhibits, and that happens. I'm not sure I've seen it. The only place I've seen it is with, for instance, design bookbinders, and their sort of competitions, which then result in a touring show, if you will. And there's at least one sort of similar touring element for artist books, and one I can think of for miniatures, that they do a pretty, I think it's annual sort of tour of the winners of their conclave competitions. The dilemma there, as with most things, is money. At one hand, you have to have people able to manage such a thing, which is a time commitment away from whatever else, and it's dollars. Again, which anything that's spent on that isn't spent somewhere else. So I think for a lot of institutions, that becomes very challenging, because the question as to whether it's sort of the highest and best use of institutional funds. With a place like Library of Congress, the metrics are a little bit different, which is to say, they are the people's library, and part of their mission is to get work into the world. And they've done, they are always doing some touring exhibit or eight, but even out. I mean, your point about accessibility is valid, and even if something is to tour, it's still a small finite thing that is in one place for X amount of time, and either you see it or you don't. There's no easy answer to any of this, and frankly, these are similar questions as one might have with the art market, with art broadly. Should sunflowers hang in a museum or on some profoundly wealthy human's wall? One of the reasons I am an advocate of book arts broadly is the accessibility, and to your point, maybe it's the accessibility at a micro level, which is to say, as an example, I have a client who conservatively owns, let's say, $100 million worth of art with the capital A. They only have X amount of wall space in the given home. They can hang X number of paintings and or display X number of sculpture at any given time. All the rest of that work, everything else they own, which is substantial, is either touring as part of some museum exhibit, or is in storage, unseen by anyone, including them. And one of the sort of, if you will, glorious bits of book arts, and of design bindings, is that the art you collect is on your shelves. And when someone comes to visit you, you can spend 15 minutes or 15 hours bouncing from one object to another, pulling things off the shelf and sharing them and showing them and experiencing them, either individually or in small groups. And it's sort of I think, the artistic value, the artistic expression embodied in a lot of modern book art, a lot of book art period, is exquisite and is profound. And that ability to actually have this material near you where you can experience it on your own terms, or potentially institutionally, where you can go to the Library of Congress and say, I would like to see Bones of the Book, and they will pull it out, and they will show you, and you will get to go through it. That's much harder to do with traditional forms of art. The flip side again being the more successful I and others are at convincing particularly private collectors that art has value equal to, again, the metrics I was talking about earlier come into play, where you begin to price things out. But it's a thing. About 10 years ago, it's probably about 10, could be even more. I have no sense of time. Someone in charge of prints at a large New England museum was quoted as saying, "I love book arts. I can buy a dozen book art items for what one Lichtenstein poster costs me." And on one hand, I'm really pleased that the museum is looking at book arts. That's a good thing. The flip side is, you're absolutely right, and I won't say it. and F you, because you're right. You can buy a dozen book art pieces for what one duplicative piece of appropriation art costs you. And I'm sorry, push comes to shove, chances are you get a tremendous amount more for your money with the book artists whose work you're exploiting by underpaying them. Um, anyway, what do I know?
I wanted to mention that Pavel and I had a bizarre and sort of fun experience with one of with the probably an expensive facsimile of a Gutenberg Bible in Moscow a couple of years ago. There was an exhibition at the Russian State Library, which holds two of Gutenberg's, as far as I remember.
Yep.
And they made
one on paper and one on vellum.
yeah, and they created an exhibition around
as one does
around well, they came from Germany as a part of loot that Soviet Union took from Germany after the
but then Russian
World War
copy
II.
burned during the bombings.
Yeah, so there was a whole exhibition built around this vellum Gutenberg, and there were scores of amazing books there, and also there was a facsimile copy open on a shelf or on a table at the side of the exhibition, and I was like, yeah, finally I can browse through it. I can see what's what. And I beelined there and started turning pages, and at the same moment, all the guards and guardians started running towards me, like, "You're not allowed to do this. That's prohibited. It's not for browsing." I was like, "Well, it's lying in the open. Why can't I? There are no signs, no nothing. Why can't I browse through it? I finally had this opportunity." Well, I had a chance to sort of turn a couple of pages, but that was that.
Yeah, but it was the facsimile that. Yeah. Why were they prohibiting?
I don't know.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, that's an interesting. The nature of facsimile can be really interesting. And there are some great examples. The dilemma is it's not inexpensive to produce a really good facsimile, but it's still a facsimile, which people have trouble with sometimes. There's a rather fabulous atlas, the name of which, of course, I'm going to forget, but there is no known complete copy of this atlas, but there are I think 5 partial copies at different places, and in the late 60s, early 70s, someone went to the effort of getting permission from everyone who owned bits of this atlas to allow them to create facsimiles of their leaves, and they issued this extremely well printed, really genuinely beautiful facsimile that actually brought together all of the disparate pieces, so that so that you can own a complete copy of this book that no longer exists as a complete copy anywhere. And I think that's sort of interesting and cool, and I don't mind owning that. I've sold a couple of them, although none recently. So, that idea of creating alternative experiences for people, I think has value. But again, there's a cost. Do you do that with everything? Do you only do that with things where the market will support it? I'll give you a hint. I'll tell you something here that hasn't been heard anywhere else earlier. I'm working with someone who is doing a sort of remarkable artist book on on tarot. And it's going to include a deck of major and minor arcana, and it's going to be very, very posh. You know, hand colored cards, and you know, your basic will know when it's done, but you know, somewhere in the 7,500 to 9,500 range, which is a nice way of saying, and there will only be 15. It's a nice way of saying most people will not get that. Either can't, or you know, can't or won't on one side or the other. But part of what we're doing with this is we will, at the same time the deluxe is released, we're going to produce a facsimile of the both the artist book and the deck of cards, that will be, you know, also a limited, but a limited of 250 or 500 copies. I haven't quite figured this out, but you know, very consciously trying to make a democratic edition that is as interesting and representative of the original as possible, so that there'll be this, you know, there'll be this ability to sort of, if you can and desire to, you can have a very posh copy, or alternatively, you know, there will be a much more accessible copy at the, you know, whatever it's going to be, $225 range. So, you know, I think a lot of people are trying to think about these things, particularly when it comes to kind of more special, higher priced, nichier pieces.
So
if that makes sense.
Yeah, I guess. Firstly, you convinced me with your explanation of or description of your Kickstarter, and I went and pledged some amount of money there. So
Thank you.
I hope it will help.
I'm very pleased. You know, yesterday, you know, I'm giddy to say, yesterday we had our first contribution of $10,000, and I know we have some others in the works, and may have someone lined up for the 25, which would be nice. You know, the flip side is, and well, it would not be impossible to simply make a couple phone calls and have this book purchased. You know, there are people in the collecting market for whom that dollar value, and it's going to be donated, and that's not prohibitively expensive, under the right circumstances. But part of the intent and hope here, you know, I would much rather have a huge pile of people, you know, donating $100, $750 towards it, than, you know, 2 or 3 people donating 25 to 50,000, or one person writing a check. Which, by the way, you're welcome to write that check, because the money will go to a good purpose. I would be lying if I said my fantasy is that we blow past what we're seeking. You know, I would love to end up at the end of this with a pile of money that then becomes the, you know, the Mark Dimunation artist book endowment at the LC, so that you know, there's money to buy artist books in Mark's name into the indefinite future. I would love that. We'll see what happens. One object, one target at a time. But I think it's a really interesting project, and a really fitting one for Mark, a really fitting one for his sense of the library and his sense of its place with the people. And I love the idea of the people giving this back. And it's worth noting, because I didn't mention this early on, Tim is doing a number of rather special things around this project, both in terms of creating a couple rewards, one of which will be offset printed, and basically everyone who gives to it will get a copy. And then there's sort of hand touched and higher levels of his original work, if you will, up to the one of one reward, in which he has agreed he will create a one-off book, a unique piece of work for whomever supports the project at that point, which will be reflective of the project as a whole. But the most interesting part is that in his style, which is highly identifiable, he is going to create a manuscript piece that will include the names of everyone who donates to this project, and wants to, obviously, if you want to donate and not have your name in here. But everyone who donates to the project, he is going to document in this single, hopefully large, manuscript piece that will be decorated in his style, if you will, and will become part of the project, will become part of the object that is donated to the Library of Congress, which is a nice way of saying, there's sort of a sense of bibliophilic immortality with this, in that, everyone who sponsors, everyone who donates to this project, will be on record, will be a part of the project at the Library of Congress forever. And I think that's kind of cool.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. We wanted to talk to you about lots of other things about book selling as well. And before we started when we discussed this live stream, you told me that you have some books by Daniel Kelm, and something about the New York Book Fair, and so could you please elaborate on that?
I would be giddy to. I've worked with Dan for a number of years. We are in the process of pulling his archive together. Dan is extremely organized, and which is the neutral way of putting that. Every project he's ever done, all of the making elements, all of the prototypes, all of his drawings, all of his notes, fiscal aspects of it, etc., are in boxes. And in some cases it's a single box, in some cases it's a dozen boxes. But all, whatever it is, 130, 150 bindings that he's done over his career, there is a box for all of them. And we're in the process of cataloging those. And then Dan is doing a rather remarkable thing, which I can't think of any other example of this. Once they are cataloged, Dan is then taking it, and he has created for himself a rather remarkable audio video setup, which allows multiple cameras. So there's a camera on him, there's a camera on the table that he's working on material. There's, I think, a whiteboard and something else. There's a number of different angles, if you will. And he's going through every one of those boxes and basically documenting, creating an oral history of what that project was like, what he did in the designing of this book. And in, you know, some of those will be 5 minutes because it was an easy project, if you will. Some of them, like Mars, is likely to be half an hour of him talking about the remarkably complex elements of how he executed that particular binding. So in the end, it's, you know, we will be placing not just his archive of his work, but also as part of that, this remarkable oral history on a book by book, binding by binding basis. Now, in the near term, he has, you know, a significant number of his books, of his bindings, which are outside the scope of the archive. And at the New York Book Fair, which opens next week on Thursday, if you're in New York City, by all means, come by. I will be debuting at that fair about 24 of Dan's bindings, which is to say I'm going to fill an entire trophy case, and then probably 2 or 3 large pieces across the top of the trophy case, that will be nothing but Dan's work. As far as I know, I've done a little bit of digging. I don't think there's ever been the scope of his work sort of on display and available in one place ever before. It's all his. And it really, you know, it runs the gamut from a few $100s to 30,000 or so. So there's this sort of wide range and really monumental diversity. Anyone who's familiar with Dan's bindings knows that you know, he comes to binding with a chemist's, with a scientist's eye and mind, and it's reflective in his work. You know, that kind of precision and complex problem solving isn't really seen elsewhere. I just excuse me, just because all things should be tied up, you know, it's worth mentioning that Dan and Tim Ely have done a number of projects together, in part because they share a mutual love of mathematics and alchemy, and you know, they've done some really wonderful collaborative pieces that revolve around, if you will, geometry and alchemy. I'm gonna, you know, I will have some of Dan's alchemical work, and highly sculptural bindings as well. Notably, I'll have the first time it's been seen, I think, really publicly, if you will, well, except at the exhibit that it was done Smithsonian, I think. You know, it's a mechanical binding of his that has no text. It you read it visually, and actually, again, because all things tie together. Mark Dimunation wrote one of the most exquisite descriptions I've seen. Let me see if I can find this very quickly.
Just while you're searching, so for how long this fair is lasting? How many days or? Oh.
It's 4 days. It runs from Thursday through Sunday. So what Mark wrote about this piece, which is called Religio Mathematica, and Mark wrote, I need a place where I can scroll it. The power of Kelm's symbolic universe is most poetically yielded by the pure book structure. Free of encumbering text, Religio Mathematica is a structure built with hinged triangular shapes. Using the 4 alchemical colors as its only source of language, the structure uses the revelation of the colors to create a text within the confines of the folded shape. The books begin folded into a cube, only red is exposed, fire. It folds into linked pyramids of white and black, water and earth. Further sequence unfolds an alchemical story that is exclusive to Kelm's work and vision. When Kelm manipulates the book, it seems to snake from one shape to another. To hear him recite the incantation of the book is magical. The unfolding of the cube marks the birth of the universe. The ultimate closing of the lotus signals its death. With this pure abstract piece, Kelm has achieved in his book. Text and binding are fully integrated. The reader and the book are wholly independent. His craft and his vision now merge to create a single experience. Reader and book, observer and the observed. The success of the piece comes from Kelm's own sincerity and modesty in his effort to embrace and impart his own hard-won view of the world. He has stepped aside to let his books speak for themselves. When you let go of perfection, you allow the book to be what it is. So I like that because it lets me loop back to Mark. And in a fashion exactly that, loop back to Mark and why he's been so important for the book world. There are many people, well, including me, as a rule, I try not to represent book art that does not involve text on paper. Most of what I work with has to have text. It's just you have to have rules. But the beauty of rules is that they're defined. Rules are defined by their exceptions, and this piece is an absolutely exquisite example of the exception that defines the rule. And Mark's ability as a librarian and a scholar, Mark's ability to encompass why this sculptural object is a book, even though it has no text, even though it has no traditional codex-based leaves, etc. Mark's ability to get across the significance of the work as a book object has been hugely important. It's part of, if you will, it's part of his legacy. Back to Dan. One of the glorious things about Dan is that he can, number one, he has a questing. He is a questing intellect, but he has a sort of insatiable desire to solve problems. And he does this over and over. He does this with books brought to him because the creator wants a very specific outcome. Here I'm thinking about the binding he did for Moth and Bone Light, which is a collection of pre-Photoshop images. Wonderful photographer who, again, I'm useless. But the book is called Moth and Bone Light, and Dan created a binding, wire-based binding that you can easily disassemble so that you can take these extraordinary photographic prints that are mounted, on the leaf, and you can exhibit them. You can, you can hang a show with this book, and at the end, put the binding back together and have it function the same way it did on day one. And that's really kind of stunning in a whole bunch of ways. And it's a remarkable binding to really look at closely. And so much of his work sort of explores those kind of limits of what a book is, what a codex can look like. And sometimes it's whimsical. He did a lovely little collection of literary quotations that is the boards, if you will, are a Schaefer pen, one of the old Schaefer ballpoint pens that has been cut, the barrel of which has been cut lengthwise, and there's a hinge at the far end, and the cap is on it. And to read the book, you remove the cap, and there's a band at the base of the cap, which is true to the pen, as with most. In this case, it's a little bit oval, and you pinch that band, and it slides off, which allows you to then open the pen, which includes single line quotations throughout. And it's just, the idea of, let's take a bunch of Schaefer pens and turn them into the boards of a book. Of course, Dan would do that. No one else would. And it's a brilliant little piece. The funny thing is, Schaefer was happy to send him all of the barrels he wanted, but it took some convincing for them to send him the caps, because the caps are Schaefer caps and they say Schaefer. And there was a sort of brand control issue they were concerned about, which it's always interesting to see what catches. I had that happen. The last time I was here, we were talking about Dark Archives and the binding project I did with Dark Archives, in which a half dozen youngish binders put design bindings on Megan Rosenblum's rather remarkable book on the history of skin books. And Farrar Straus was kind enough to send me a dozen text blocks, but they only did that after I promised not to have the book bound in skin, which I thought was kind of cool. I'll note they didn't say I couldn't have one bound in human bone, so we'll see what happens. Little things, nuance is important, but it's going to be, well, the New York Fair. I mean, the New York Fair broadly is unlike basically any other fair anywhere. The probably the closest thing to it would be the London Fair, firsts now. But the New York Fair at the Park Avenue Armory is unusual in a whole bunch of ways. And if you want to spend several days sort of stunned at the breadth and depth of what you're looking at, it's a good weekend to spend in New York. We're going to be debuting a number of rather extraordinary things. Dan's, the centerpiece obviously is a couple dozen bindings from Dan, which I look at them. They're spread over a table downstairs, and it's really humbling to look at the scope and diversity of that work, and to have it all in one place, and it's really quite remarkable. But we're also we're going to be debuting in this form. They were both on exhibit at for a time, but I have two of Graham Patton's curved origami bindings, with folded boards and folded text blocks, as he does in a rather remarkable manner. I have, there'll be new work.
That's one of the things we want to discuss on our live stream as well. this type of structures,
the folded
these bindings, yeah.
Graham is unusual. I wish you'd told me, and I would have had it here in my hands. It's unfortunately downstairs. It's a remarkable bit of work. There is a video for anyone so inclined. If you go to the Lux Mentis TikTok, I did a video of going through Graham's book. That's all of 30 seconds long, so it's a lovely little sound bite. If one of you wants to try and grab that and throw it up, that would be fine. TikTok is a absolutely weirdly fascinating place. I have to admit, I ignored it for many years because my teenage son kept saying, "Dad, you have to check this out." So of course my reaction to that was, yeah, no.
Well, my not teenage wife was telling me for several years, you have to go there. iBookBinding has to be on TikTok, and I was like,
I have apologized to my son, which I'm not inclined to do as a general rule because he's a twit. But I had to apologize to him on this particular point because it really is. A lot of my background's in technology. From a tech standpoint, TikTok is a work of sheer genius. The algorithm is, it's one of those things that it turns a fair number of people off because when you go to it clean, the level of vapid is extraordinarily high. And if that's where you want to stay, you can certainly do that. It's up to you. I don't judge much. But if you spend a day or two seeking specific things, seeking design bindings and fine press and, antiquarian books and things you would naturally think to search for on TikTok, there are people producing genuinely wonderful, fascinating things, and some really interesting, unusual. Jennifer and her daughter, who are Star Shaped Press, she does a tremendous amount of really sophisticated book artwork with ornaments. She creates art. She creates images using ornaments. I don't know what that was. And her daughter, who is clearly in charge of the TikTok account, her daughter has, regularly posts these wonderful short videos from around the print shop, around their hot lead shop. And it's just great fun. And obviously there's, the dilemma with TikTok is that it's just a black hole. There are rabbit holes and then there is TikTok. It's the sort of, I have to make a phone call in 5 minutes, I'll look at a couple videos and 3 hours later, you're like, damn it, how did this happen again? Anyway. So
the algorithm of TikTok is it's even impossible to say it's better than Facebook or Instagram. It's just absolutely not comparable. What's Instagram and Facebook offer compared to TikTok. So
I think it will never happen. It would be fascinating to look at the differences, or fascinating for the geeky of us. the differences in the algorithms, because TikTok's ability to learn you, and then to feed you, it's lovely to be able to look at the people you follow. That's good. You've chosen to follow them, so you expect those to be moderately interesting to you. But the For You page, once you've sort of taught that algorithm what it is you like, its ability to kind of spoon feed you, I have discovered a bunch of printers and binders I had never heard of before, entirely because because TikTok said, here, you should look at this interesting young Asian binder who's working in a small village with no electricity in his shop at all. It's quite fascinating. So
Yeah.
anyway, but we're going to, so we've got a fair bit of new design bindings that are going to be debuted in New York. We've got a fair bit of new artist books, including some new or new to market, if you will, work from Nancy Levitt, which is calligraphic, original art, and then hand all of her lettering. She does her lettering, and similarly some new work from Suzanne Moore, and others. It's really, I sometimes suffer from an overabundance of riches. The great dilemma to have is to have too much kind of fabulous stuff to fit into one booth. As it is this year, we're doing, we we bit the bullet and did a double booth by ourselves. We have traditionally split a double booth, with a friend, and that was largely because I hate book caves. At many shows, and New York's a great example because it costs so much that you really want to maximize your display space. So like at the New York Fair and most of the big fairs, you have let's say a 10 by 10 booth, which has a 6-foot counter case or 5-foot counter case, at the front, and often a trophy case at the side. So your opening is your access and egress to the booth is 2.5 feet wide. And it's only 10 by 10 on its best day, which is a nice way of saying if there are 2 or 3 people in the booth already, a lot of people I do. You look at it and you go, that looks interesting. I'll try to remember to come back here. And there aren't 3 people in there already. And that's less of an issue with bigger booths, whether it's a double like this or it's the reason why many people will share, or put together 2 singles and take down the separating wall, because it allows you to have an entrance and egress at both ends. And there's something psychological about that, that people are much more likely to come in if something catches their eye, and not suffer that kind of book cave of effect that I dislike. The dilemma, of course, being that it's significantly more expensive. Sometimes you just go, well, it's just money. But it's going to be, we're going to have an entire case of what I lovingly refer to as sex, death, and the devil, largely occult, demonology, witchcraft material, in one case, and then the other 4 are going to be, or most of the other 4 will be some combination of design bindings, probably an entire trophy case and a half, of design bindings, and the balance with book arts. We also have a couple representative pieces from larger collections that we're dealing with. I've been deaccessioning a history of computing that's fascinating, and includes some really interesting, unusual early pieces. You know, the article that defined the word bit as a computer term, and you know, the first symposium proceedings of the West Coast Computer Fair, FAIRE, because you're an asshole. And one of, you know, there's a whole bunch in that that's actually really fabulous, but my favorite is that there is this little tiny advertisement for Apple Computer at an address they were only at for about 2.5 months or so, after they had moved out of his garage and before they moved into their first real facility. So, you know, as a snapshot of time, it's a fascinating little piece. So there's that, and then there, you know, the other major project I've been working on for a year now. I am in the process of deaccessioning the private library, the private collection of Dr. Oliver Sacks, who wrote Awakenings and The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, and Musicology, and work on synesthesia. You know, he never used the term, but basically the entire field of neurodivergency pretty much stands on Oliver's shoulders. He was a polymath. He grew up, his best friend through his entire life was actually another polymath, of course, named Eric Korn, who was a bookseller, and I mean, did a number of different things, but was primarily a bookseller. And most of this library, Eric was responsible for helping build. And I, you know, the first book report I wrote at 14 was on Awakenings. You know, Oliver Sacks has been a hero of mine since I was a little boy. And the idea of you know, his library is like walking through his mind, which is to say, it's all over the place. It's a fascinating tour of how extraordinarily questing his intellect was, and his interests were, and it has the added tremendous benefit that he was very fond of arguing with people in the margins. So considerable number of the books, something on the order of maybe a dozen bankers boxes worth, have his marginalia in them. And in, you know, in some cases, and I've posted some of these to the Instagram account now and then, but, you know, he particularly had an issue with Kant, and there are several books of Kant with him, you know, vehemently arguing with Kant in the margins, and it's amazing. It's so good. With a bit of like, you know, again, it's a horrible rabbit hole, because what I should be doing is cataloging these quickly and at sort of a gross level, because all of the annotated material is going to be kept together, and is probably going to join his literary archive, which is a New York Public, because it kind of humanizes and contextualizes all of his work, which is to say, when he talks about Kant in some of his work, you know, suddenly you can look to the you know, 7 or 8 books on Kantian philosophy, in which he, you know, which were not just part of his library, but are heavily annotated, and really contextualize what he's doing. So on one hand, I should do that part really quickly because it's all together and it really just needs to be a meta level description. But I might have spent weeks reading far too closely his handwriting, because how can you not read this remarkable marginalia? So yeah, there'll be a couple of the sort of outlier, unusual pieces from that. There's going to be several catalogs that come out of this, sort of a catalog of material that was inscribed to him from people he knew and or worked with. A bunch of material sort of from his library, which is to say books that he signed, books that have his mark in them, but not annotations. And that really runs the gamut from when he was, 14 years old and reading Darwin's Origin of Species. I'm not making that up. To relatively current, shortly before he passed away. So that's going to be, and a fair bit of, one of the things I'll probably have at the fair, he had an absolutely beautiful copy of The Rambler, which, was sort of a hugely important piece in publishing history. And it was issued in parts, as was common, and generally folded in half lengthwise. And you can still see, the fold marks, because this wasn't the subsequently printed. Now it's complete. This is someone who had all the parts and bound it up when it was done. It's really a lovely example of the Rambler. So I'll have a few kind of representative things from his library. We'll see. We'll see what I end up deciding to bring. There's a piece that I can't not talk about. He and Bjork were friends, which, like full stop, Dr. Sachs and Bjork hanging out together. I'm done. I'm done. They met at a conference and like basically fell in love with each other's brains, which makes a huge amount of sense if if you think about either and both of them. So anyway, Oliver and his partner were traveling through Iceland, and Bjork invited them to dinner, and they went, which is another. I would pay a great deal to be a fly on a wall at a dinner party of Bjork and Oliver. But what I have from that is this was just after the Met exhibition of Bjork's work, and which they issued a sort of multi-volume exhibition catalog in a slipcase, and I have the copy that Bjork inscribed to Oliver with an inscription that reads across the top, Oliver, one of the most fertile minds I have ever met. Warmthness, with 3 S's for reasons that remain mysterious. Warmthness, Bjork. So I may bring that. It's equally possible that I will end up keeping that myself forever. We'll see. The thing funny and just tangential, do you know the book Gödel Escherbach? Doug Hofstetler?
Nope.
Yeah.
Piece on chaos theory, and of the relationship between math and art and music.
Gödel Escherbach, right?
Gödel Escherbach, yes.
Yeah.
I remember the first time I read that when I was 15. I've probably in the first 5 years, 15 to 20, 22, I probably read that damn book, 5 or 6 times. And having Oliver's copy of Gödel Bach is kind of astounding. The other thing that I have out of that library, which amazed me, he had shelf markers, metal, metal shelf markers goes, and you can change the label as to what it all is. And the man who was helping, design his library, had relatively recently, prior to this, helped Allen Ginsberg change his library. And he took all of the red shelf marking plates that he had removed from Allen Ginsberg's library and used them in Oliver Sacks's library. So I have this like huge pile of shelf markers that were originally with Allen Ginsberg and then Oliver Sacks. I mean, I don't know. It's one of those things. Other than the humor value of it, it doesn't. It's not significant in any scholarly way, but I have to admit I'm toying. My shelves are too thick for these shelf markers, and I would be lying if I haven't sort of consciously thought about changing out all of the shelves simply so that I can use these shelf markers. We'll see. I wouldn't bet against it. Let's put it that way. We'll see what the timeline looks like, but it's hard to resist being able to say, oh yeah, no, the shelf markers were Allen Ginsberg's before they were Oliver Sacks's. Now they're here. You gotta find your joy where you can.
So we are sort of running over time already, and Pavel, do you have any more questions? Because I have a last
Oh,
one,
I
probably.
have so many, but
Oh.
I think we have to invite Ian again.
Yeah.
I am happy to come back and blather about just about anything. No,
Not just a book lover, but also a fellow geek. That's important.
Exactly. Well, and that's the thing, though. Most of the best book people I know have geeky tendencies too. There's a lot of weird overlap in some of this, and at the end of the day, this stuff, the book as an object, the form, the content, the idea of this sort of transfer of intellectual history from one generation, one form to another, one generation to another. There's nothing about the book world that isn't interesting. Even the tedious, hideous parts of it are interesting in certain ways. I personally loathe Nicholas Sparks. But it's still interesting, and the phenomena around his success is interesting in a slightly horrifying way. But it's endlessly fascinating. So all I would say, in the end, thank you for having me on, and for anyone so inclined, do check out the Kickstarter. It would be really wonderful. It will be really wonderful to be able to put this book at the Library of Congress, and I look forward. To being able to sort of hand deliver that to the new the new chief of Rare Books. So, but sure, I'll come back. I'll come back whenever you need an hour and a half
we'll
filled
do that.
with.
We'll find a good reason to invite you again.
Right.
I just wanted to ask you about the New York Book Fair. How reasonable are the prices there? Because I had I don't have many experiences with book fairs in I have never been to any book fairs in the US, and I have some experience in with European book fairs, and during the years we lived in France I visited Salon du Livre Art in Paris, and my impression was that it's even worse than visiting a museum, because you sort of can buy this stuff, but price tags starting with 10,000 euros and up to, I don't know, 150,000 euros sort of make you very unhappy, because, well, once again, there were some books I was able to buy, to sort of
Yeah.
say myself that they are sort of within my budget, but still.
Yeah. Yeah. The short answer to that is the New York Book Fair is not, as a general rule, a cheap date. There will be more spectacular material on the floor there than you'll see anywhere else. But the dilemma with spectacular material is that it's priced like spectacular material. That said, the ABAA has worked really hard. There's a program where you can sign up beforehand, dealers sign up beforehand, basically guaranteeing that there will be items in their booth for under $100. And every booth that's doing that, there's a little placard. I forget what it looks like, but there's a little placard that sort of lets you visually know that there are items in the booth that aren't ridiculous.
That's smart.
And I will say, in our booth there will be things running from, I don't think we have anything below 50, but we have a handful of things around $50 to orders of magnitude more than $50. Rather a lot. And we're nowhere near, there will be items on the floor there that are north of 7 digits. This is a fair where it's not uncommon to have more than one object on the floor that's $1 million+. And the number, it's not often that you're anywhere where there are sort of 2 or 3 Kelmscott Chaucers in their original boards. So you can decide where you want to spend your $250,000. This copy or that. How often do you have problems like that? So it's fascinating. I sympathize that there is definitely a sense of poshness. Hell, it's the Upper East Side, at the Park Avenue Armory. There's nothing about this that speaks of bargains. The flip side is there's material there that you just won't see anywhere else. And as I say, there are a number of dealers who make a real effort to have a very broad range of material. I've sold in the past. I've sold books to an 11-year-old at the New York Fair, who was there with her parents and spent a long time. In that case, it was miniatures, and I have a fair number of miniatures that are sort of $45 to several hundred. And she spent a long time basically doing price comparison on the books she was fascinated by. And
isn't that the idea? You get them young, you give them something to buy cheap, and then they come back.
I'm basically a heroin dealer.
And now we're banned on YouTube.
Right. Little things. Anyway,
yeah.
Well, it's always a pleasure, and as I say, anytime you want to kill some time, I am probably willing to wax esoteric on random crap.
Okay, well, let's do that again.
We could do a sort of interesting dog and pony show maybe around design bindings. I know you do a fair bit with insular art, with having
Yeah.
particular binders on. But right now you mentioned Kate Holland. I have a binding of hers that I love very much. Right now I probably have the work of maybe 2 dozen different young creating binders. And it might be really fun to plan for and sort of show some depth and breadth of work rather than just the work of one person can really sort of do an interesting tour through what modern design binding looks like on the market today.
Sure, let's do that. I'm all for it.
Sounds
that's
fascinating. Yeah.
that's a date.
All right, cool. All
Okay,
right.
so I'll stop the streams and we'll stay here for a bit longer until the stream drops on both platforms, and then that's it. Thank you everyone for being with us today, or well, to anyone who is watching it in the future. We'll probably also cut some bits of it to post on TikTok and Instagram. We'll see how it goes. And please
Of
check the
course you
links.
will.
Please check the links. There is a link to Kickstarter we discussed earlier in the description, in the very bottom of the description. So scroll down and support the project. And see you all next time.